So there is a condition that affects anybody. Doesn't matter where you're from, who you are, or what your social status is. And it's directly linked to an increased chance of heart attacks, diabetes, mental health issues such as depression, and even premature death. I'm talking about loneliness. And today on The Mental Space, I'm going to get into that with our guest, Dr. Shefali Verma, who is medical director and specialises in integrative medicine. Dr. Shefali, welcome to The Mental Space.
Oh, thank
Great
you for
to
having
see you
me.
again.
Yes.
So, my first question, integrative medicine. Tell us a little bit more about what that is and your journey, your superhero origin story.
So for me, I trained as a medical doctor, and then I went into sports medicine. But in my final year at medical school, I actually lost my dad. And when I lost my dad, it kind of changed. My dad was a doctor. He was surrounded by doctors. And dad actually was in a coma for 18 days before he passed away. And that kind of changed me from being in the medical space to being in the relative space, to be a relative of a patient. And that kind of changed what I wanted to give to my patients once I qualified. So it didn't sit very well for me the first few years of medicine. And so I then retrained into sort of, functional medicine, which is looking at root cause. After sports medicine was a safe space for me. I love sport. And it was like, what's the worst I can tell somebody? They can't play their sport. It wasn't like life and death. And I feel like I needed that distance from sort of morbid, medical sort of, situations, really. And so I retrained in functional medicine, which is looking at sort of root cause of diseases, understanding the pathway of diseases and why things happen. And I basically ended up coming back into the medical space and seeing mainly chronic diseases, really, management. I started off with, weight, people coming in to lose weight. And then you realize that, well, what you are on the outside is very much a picture of what you are on the inside. So the physiology is what's kind of key to health. And nothing happens overnight, as much as it seems like it a lot of the time. It's like this, and then it's that. Everyone's like, oh, doctor, now. But it's not the that. It's all the little thises that lead up to the that I believe, for me, integrative medicine is what looks at. It's what I choose to look at, and that's what I'm most passionate about, the proactive health space.
So it's trying to take the focus from the end of the result and actually put it maybe at the beginning of the process.
100%. And that, I would say, after 15 years of now medical practice in the UAE, I feel like that has become my real focus. My purpose has evolved into proactive healthcare, because I believe that the earlier we are thinking of proactive, we will move away from reactive healthcare. Yeah. It's not when you're sick, but it's like, I want people to come to see me and not be like, doc, what's wrong with me? I want people to come to see me who's like, doc, how can I make myself better? Yeah. That just changes the energy.
Yeah, totally.
And that's, I feel like medicine is, to a lot of people, they're scared. It's depressing. I don't want to go there. I don't want to know what's going on. And it kind of leads to bad end stories, really. And if you want to change your story, you can't rewrite the last few pages. Otherwise, that ending's not going to make sense. You've got to rewrite chapters for it to actually flow well. And that's kind of like what I feel like, that's kind of like what I end up telling my patients. It's about rewriting your chapters. It's all about proactive healthcare. And that's how I like to think of integrative medical, my definition.
I absolutely love that definition.
Yay.
I want to circle back to where we came in, because this week, on the mental space, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Rangan Chatterjee on just a few weeks back. And he was talking about the impact of loneliness, and he was equating it to having a physical impact on us equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Just this week, we've had the U.S. Surgeon General, who's now turned around and said, actually, loneliness is as important a public health topic as obesity and should be taken as seriously as tobacco. Mm-hmm. We've seen this in the UAE as well, actually. It's interesting because if you go to the Museum of the Future, they actually talk about loneliness becoming an epidemic in their kind of retrospective look back from 50 years hence.
That's interesting.
what's your, through your work, what's your interpretation of just like how serious loneliness is? Because it sounds like it's one of the thises rather than the that.
100%. It's funny. I say this a lot in clinic, whereby I talk about social interactions a lot. So I talk about 8 daily multipliers, that I think 8 things that you need to do daily to kind of like look after your controllable stresses. And one of them is social interaction. So obviously the most common way of looking at loneliness is I don't have someone, or I'm by myself.
Yeah.
But I was just on holiday now, and that's where I read the most. But I read this book where they talked about in people's life, you have your marginal decade before maybe you pass away. And a lot of the times, protecting their mental space becomes important when it comes to the health span of this long life we want to try and generate. So it's not about creating, let's give you years, but we want to give you good years, right? So in the proactive health space, it's about providing not just the number of years, but the quality of life within those number of years. And one of the things that we find important is your mental space. And when you're much older, theoretically, you might lose your spouse. You lose your purpose. Like after a job, you retire. Why do so many people pass away so soon? There are studies that show that, say, teachers in the first year of retiring, there is a surge of either illness or death. Yeah. When you lose your purpose, why is the impact? There's an element of loneliness, right? Social isolation is a form of torture. Right? If we think about that, right? It is
Guantanamo Bay,
it is a form of torture.
Stick them on isolation, yeah.
We need human interaction. We need mental stimulation. All those things impact, but they lead to like depression. They lead to all those things. And then that causes stress. Chronic stress is a silent killer, right? So on all levels of, whether you're not in a job, whether you're not happy with the people you surround yourself with, you may have a lot of people, but you may not have quality people. So social interaction in your job, for example, it doesn't have to be when you're older or when you don't physically have people. You could be in a job where there are 100 employees. You spend 12 hours a day in a job that you don't like with the people that you're with for those 12 hours of your day. You are lonely. It's not about physical people. Yeah. It is that whole, notion of what it means to be alone.
And that's often toxic workplaces are defined by people feeling isolated.
Correct.
Even though they're sat at their desk and they're surrounded by people.
That's it. Not having anyone to talk to.
He'll kill me for mentioning it if he sees this, but because I'm a boomer. I'm not a boomer, I'm Gen X. But my boy, he's gone through university. He's Gen X. I, as his parents, sometimes worry about our younger generation because, we hear the phrases around social media that we're more connected than ever, but we're so disconnected.
We're the least connected
from
as well.
Each other.
Yeah.
And I see his generation where they communicate on chat.
Mm-hmm.
Can chat replace human interaction? Or are we building up a loneliness issue there with the young generation?
So it's interesting. So I think you only know what you miss when you know what you had. So I think in some of these kids, they really don't know what it's like to have great connection. So this is their definition of connection. Yeah. So it's hard to say how much stress it's really putting on them. Yeah. If I'm being kind of like looking at both sides in the true concept of things, fine. Right? Yeah. It makes sense.
Balance is good.
Right?
Yeah.
But I do think that when we look at things like the gaming individuals, going online in the social media and then watching other people's perception of happy lives. And then you're kind of thinking that that's what's happy. And you then start living in your head with the stress of you not having what, and you have no one to talk to because that's where you spend most of your time. Yeah. That is lonely. Not understanding I think not talking to people and not having human connections over time affects relationships. So you might not have, the connections that you and I would talk about growing up and having, but you also at some point are looking to have relationships. whether it be at work, whether it be with friends, whether it be as a relationship in terms of your spouse, that will be affected because you don't have those norms. Again, not learning to talk to people affects your stress management. We're taking away a huge tool that could be so helpful, and they don't know how to use it.
Well, it's interesting because, we look at the Cigna research. We worked with Cigna on their Wellbeing 360 research, and Gen Z came back as the most stressed generation right now. And we're seeing, the world of work reporting a disconnect between our kids who are coming out of university and then going into the world of work, but they don't have the soft skills.
No.
They're not able to have this kind of conversation and look, and that's a really stressful period for them to kind of go through and learn that I can't just chat with my boss on WhatsApp.
No. And you can't. And I think that's where the problem lies. It's fine when you're on your own, your school, and all the kids are doing the same. But when you're in the big, bad world, as it were, or you get to work, it hasn't yet caught up. So the younger generation are moving really fast into this world that we really haven't seen in our generation.
Absolutely.
But the workforce is still very traditional. It's not there yet.
Yeah.
And that disconnect of them not understanding will probably cause problems. And I think because they won't have the ability to stress manage themselves, I think we will find a lot of people who will appear more burnt out earlier than not so much about the resilience. I don't think you have to, but I think their own ability to hold themselves accountable by themselves. I just don't think they have the same amount of independence as we do. And if we're not careful, I do think the next generation is really going to have a tough time.
Well, it's fascinating because we look at the figures and it doesn't really matter which piece of research we talk about. I mean, we look at the kids and sometimes say that, I've heard people in my generation call Gen Z snowflakes, and they're entitled and they're not resilient. And yet you look at something like the Bupa Executive Survey, which says that 55% of bosses, they call it the global boss loss. Leaders have had enough.
Correct.
People of my generation don't like the burnout, the stress, because we are always on. When you have people coming to you, and I know earlier you referenced 8
daily multipliers.
Eight daily multipliers. Do you want to talk us through some of those? Like, how do you begin to start helping people when they come to you? And what kind of condition are they often in when they come to you?
So I have various different sort of demographics. So I have the clinic. I have a clinic here in Dubai. I see patients. Normally they come in with problems. That's where they come to see a doctor.
Yeah.
They may have a newly diagnosed condition. They may be struggling with not being well, but when they go to see all the other conventional doctors, they are kind of cleared of all the sicknesses. So they might not be sick, but they are not well.
Yeah.
And now, because of social media, they're able to go online and ask Dr. Google. Dr. Google gives them a host of different sort of potential diagnoses, and they need help.
ChatGPT now.
That's it, right? And so they'll come in and they will sort of want to have a second opinion. Yeah. Those people, I would say I see more chronic diseases. And in those chronic diseases, they have a problem. We will test according to those testing. I will prioritize treatment, and very much it might be, loads of different tests and then maybe some supplements, some treatment, and so on and so forth. And then once what are they here for is kind of solved, or they're in a better position, then we will fine tune the other lifestyle factors that may come into play in terms of what were the thises that caused that.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's not about just clearing that, but I actually don't want to see you again. So let's clear all the thises, right? And so the 8 daily multipliers for me is very much on sort of nutrition, on hydration, social interaction, mental health in terms of mindfulness. So how you think and how you talk, sleep, big one. So sleep and recovery is a really big one that people kind of don't give enough importance to. In fact, they steal their sleep often to do other things. Then the physiology is the problem and all the medical stuff. So the detoxification and all that kind of stuff. Air quality is also another one that's really big on my agenda now. I have some really great people in UAE who are really, really keen to, build awareness on that. So I like to be in that sort of entity, and exercise. So those are the 8 daily multipliers that I will often talk to. In a corporate setting where I would, my consultancy, we go in and then we create strategies for a company to develop a health culture, depending on what they find is their priority. I do that. I teach them the education. So one of the things that I feel in a corporate world of what wellness is, it's not enough nowadays to give somebody a gym membership or a massage every week, right? It's almost like ticking the box. But if you educate them, they will make their choices, right? So I believe that the true good corporate wellness program has to be based on education. So let's educate them on the 8 daily multipliers. These are their controllable stresses that often we throw out the window when we're stressed.
Fascinating, because, within this, this conversation, we started off with well-being, and as you say, gym memberships, or is it a yoga session in the office? Nothing wrong with yoga. It's actually a tremendous workout.
Yeah.
And now, our mission at Mentals, particularly with our website, The Mental Space, we're trying to advocate for better mental health in the workplace. But how often do you hear companies asking about how their employees sleep?
Yeah.
It's a question that's just not asked.
But they're also champion the longer you work, the more hours that you're there, and you're someone who doesn't complain because you did an all-nighter, well done you. It's not well done you, right? Like we're too short term. Our straws are too narrow and we're not looking big enough. So when people leave, they get a new person.
Yeah.
And when people, the time that people feel like I'm done is when they're burnt out and they know they're not being cared for, or when it impacts their other life that they're doing it all for. Then they realize either I'm sick. If I'm sick, I can't do it for my family anyway. No one cares about me at work, so why am I doing it? And now I actually can't do the daily things that I used to be able to do because I just don't have the ability or the capacity to do so. Or now I'm diagnosed with something that is too late. I'm not going to act reactive.
It kind of feels like we've been hoodwinked to a degree.
Yeah.
In that, I remember like 30, 40 years ago, there was a bargain between employer and employee, which was you come and give me your sweat and toil between these very specific hours. You will get this long-term security in terms of your job, which also helps you with your mental health. But also you'll have downtime, and you will leave the office behind you at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, and on the weekends. Mm-hmm. Now we've got to this point, it seems that work is more important than our physical health, our mental health, our family health. But what's the risk for corporations if they carry on with this kind of behavior? Because it feels to me, particularly with Gen Z and the millennials, the gig is up.
Yeah, but they'll walk out now.
Yeah.
These are the questions that I think. So, back in the day when I look at my parents' generation, they would accept a lot. But it was almost like they inherited that acceptance from the culture of what was. Because we didn't have the internet. We didn't have the social media. We didn't have other people's perfect life perceptions of what it should be. And now I think the struggle is the living costs are up, right? Like if we really think about living costs are up, it takes a lot to get a decent wage. And if we just talk about the UAE, it is tough. It's getting better in terms of all the things they're trying to provide us over time. But the younger generation are coming back. They go to university. They don't want to stay in those countries. They actually want to come back home because life is technically a little bit easier. But they will quit. They're more entrepreneurs because there are a lot of successful entrepreneurs who are like YouTubers. There are things that have never, and I think when my kids are 10, I don't even know what job will be out then. I can't tell them to do medicine or, engineering or law or all the things that we did. There's just so many different potentials. You can create a business out of anything that they will be quick to be like, no. So the great resignation, as people are talking about it, yeah, that's a risk for current if we don't change something.
So when you go into workplaces, give us, if you can, without giving your entire profession away, some of the things that you actually tell workplaces, like how do you put in better sleep practice? So how do you we all have an individual responsibility. We'll come on to that in a moment. But the advice that you give to corporations, even in terms of sleep, how does a company even address that? Or mental health, which was one of the 8 as well. How do you get them to start that process?
So typically now, I do like to sort of hand out a survey to see what individuals think is good practice. A lot of the times when I run sort of like a seminar of, say, a certain amount of people, I will often ask, like, who sleeps well, what the definition of sleep well is. And when you actually give them the definition of sleeping well, you realize that all the people who thought they slept well don't sleep well. When you explain why sleep gets affected over time, so when you start to become burnt out, or there's more of an adrenal issue or stress issue or cortisol issue, why is sleep affected? And what happens when you sleep? So when you steal sleep, you're stealing cellular processes that only happen at night. Over a day, it might not make a difference. But over years, you realize and you explain how that matters, plays a big part in how they feel the next day, how they're productive the next day, how their mood is the next day, how it affects what you choose to eat the next day, how what you eat makes you full or not full, or it plays an impact on it all. And when you start to talk about sleep, and I am a real storyteller, so I like to tell stories, anecdotal evidence from my patients or whatever have you, you start to see the light bulb in all the people that you're talking to. But what I like to do is I like to give them all the sleep hygiene sort of pointers and get them to practice it over a month to 6 weeks and get them to then, that's all you focus on. So I believe in not necessarily needing to use all our secret weapons at once. Can I get you to do one thing? Do it well. Let it become part of you before we move on to the next one. Because often when you do it all and say something doesn't work, you actually don't know what didn't work.
Yeah.
Get the sleep down. Can we come back to that survey? Can we come back to the same questions we asked in that first bit? And then can we see change? When they see change from each other, and often they all talk because they're all trying to do the practice, then they implement it in their families, your husband, your kids. Then those people implement it in their families. That's how that sort of, contagious good habits happen within a family, within your society, within your culture. And that's when your hereditary, things that you think are hereditary, you start to realize, were diseases really familial? Or was it the lifestyle that I learned from the generations that ended up with the same diseases?
Now, talking to you about this topic, you just reminded me of a podcast we did recently with Phil, and we talked about hustle culture. The startup scene, we talked about entrepreneurs. The startup scene here in the UAE is massive, but there's so much glorification of hustle culture. Mm-hmm. I'm going to pull the all-nighters. I'm going to work 7 days a week. I'm not going to sleep to get this over the line. And yet, we have 9 out of 10 businesses fail. Do you see any connection between that kind of like not prioritizing self, not prioritizing sleep, in fact, glorifying the absolute opposite and failure rate?
Correct. But I also think your perception of it not working, I think you've also reached a point that the stress of it is too much. So I believe we all have a stress bucket. And the stress bucket has the uncontrollable stresses and the controllable stresses. So put my controllable stresses as those 8 daily multipliers. Mm-hmm. If I was to control the 8 daily multipliers, then all I really need to worry about, I can't worry about the uncontrollable ones because I can't do anything about them. But both stresses fill this bucket. The only way I can control this bucket from overflowing is by controlling the controllable. When people do the all-nighters, don't sleep, expect to be sharp the next morning, to get that, to be the best that they can be. They are eating rubbish because they don't need to eat when they're stressed. They're coffeeed up to the eyeballs because that's what's going to keep them awake.
Yeah.
They're bloated because what they've eaten has affected them. They don't want to talk to anyone but the people that they need to talk to. There's zero social. They are a nightmare to be a part of. They're not attractive. Nobody really wants to who's going to want to do business with you? Really, if we think about entrepreneurs, most entrepreneurs, when they get their first gig, is actually based upon our camaraderie, how we get on. Yeah, you know what? I'd like to work with this person.
Yeah.
Right? Like a job interview, even if we go conventional job interviews, it's not really about what what you did at university anymore. It's going to be how you interact. When I go to a parent-teacher meeting now, I don't sit there and say, how's her maths? How's her English? As much as I care about it, it's not my first most importance. Are they good kids? Do they have friends? Are they good with each other? Because ultimately, it's all about role play, right? Can I work in this organization with these people, and are they going to get along? Is she going to get along? If she's going to get along, they've all got the same sort of, CV, aren't they really? And that's what happens in entrepreneurs. You let it go. If I get a paper cut, you get a paper cut, but you're bloated, you haven't slept. That paper cut's going to hurt you far more than it's going to hurt me, right? Because I feel good, and I think people just throw away those things when they're stressed. That hustle. Yes, you're a champion because you worked so hard. You didn't have a holiday. You ruin everything else. That's your controllable stresses. It's not gonna last, and I think there is. I think no matter what you're doing, obviously there are days, I'm not saying I'm perfect, but the intention has to be right, is to know what your 8 daily multiplies are. And those should be your non-negotiables, because then everything else is manageable. Even managing the uncontrollable stresses become more manageable when you've managed the controllable stresses.
Often have a conversation with people who are in practice, which is kind of based on physician heal thyself. Like, what challenges you and how do you get yourself out of them? Or can you tell us a period that has been challenging, and what was the impact on you, but also then what you learned from it, how you got yourself out of that position?
I mean, I think that we've had all kinds of I've been through a recent, let's just take, we were evicted from our house, for example.
Which is something that so many people right now are going through.
It was in the middle of summer. We had 3 weeks to move, okay? 3 weeks to move. It was in the middle of summer. It was the middle of COVID. I was pretty packed at work. David was really busy. The children were off, So one of the things that we decided to do was, I took them with me wherever I went. So they actually kind of stayed with mom and made decisions with me on the house, on the whatever have you. But the one thing that we did decide to do was, no matter what happened, we all came together for dinner. And at dinner, during those tough times, when you feel really rubbish, we always play this game. And it's a game that we ask each other, goes around the table, and we ask them 3 questions. And the 3 questions would be, what's the one good thing you did for someone today? What's the one good thing someone did for you today? And what's the one thing you learned today? And the reason why I do this at dinner is because I believe subconsciously what you're feeling before you go to bed appears in your dreams. You kind of feel that same emotion. So I always tell people, if ever you're going to write a grateful log or you're going to journal, it's always nice to do it at nighttime, because you end up having subconsciously those sort of dreams, especially if you get deep sleep. Then it'd be negative. You remember those days where you'd study for exams. In the middle of the night, you're answering questions with your hands up, and then you wake up and you're sleep. And you're right, going through that. Yeah. One thing I wanted the children, no matter how things are bad, is for us to have A, family time, B, play this game so that you look for the good. You can find good in all bad, right? So mommy and daddy are going through a stressful time, and we might, lash out sometimes. But when we come together at home as a family, we come together, we play the game, we make sure we eat together, we spend quality time together, no matter how short, whatever, in the evening is what you remember before you go to bed. We never go to sleep upset. So once David and I made that commitment that we're going to have arguments, but we're not going to go to bed upset, the girls will do the same. They follow you, right? So again, generationally, this is what they will remember because they're sponges at this time. And you know, I can't tell you when we found the house that we're now living in, we looked for we've downsized, it's smaller, there's a lot of negative, but there's also a lot of positive. And in the end, as much as it was stressful to find it because of the way the house situation works, I feel like you had to I still kind of got up and went to the gym. I might not have done an hour, but I might have done half an hour. You know, I did for my mental health to be able to have that 30 minutes where it was about me and I could just have a little movement, which was good for me. I cared about what we ate at home. I didn't sit there and, even when we were moving, I did not organize for us to have takeout after takeout. But if we were to have a takeout, you know, I don't generally have fast food, so I would choose better delivery. We're lucky we have that opportunity to do that. We should still sleep, you know. We should still do all the things that are important, even though something has taken us sort of off our normal, you know, thing. You know what I mean? Like that, for me, that was something that I felt like I didn't want a stressful situation to impact the way the children saw us coping with it, even though they did see it being tough and we were not happy.
You have been super generous with your time. I want to ask one last question, which is to circle all the way back to where we came in on loneliness. If anyone's watching or listening to this podcast and they do think this is impacting them, what's your advice to them?
So I think that number one is to look at your social circle. And are they truly, especially over here where I think it's an abundance of, you know, wealth or the perception of wealth, and it's all the big things, but the small things are like true connections. Find your true connection. I think that's important. Is find, it doesn't have to be many, but do you have true connections where you have an outlet? Number one. Number two, I think we have passed the stage where talk therapy is a taboo. If you find yourself where you can't almost go through your thoughts by yourself and you need someone to help you go through your bag of troubles, again, it's okay to seek help. There are plenty of really good people here.
Yeah.
No, don't have times where you don't have a purpose. You know, purpose is really important. What are you waking up for? What do you want to do? Even in the time where you're thinking about what it might be, but continuously be active in that thought process. I think loneliness is not just about people, right? It's about, it can be on many levels. And I think a purpose, when you've lost purpose, I think that can be quite detrimental to your well-being.
I could talk to you about this all day, but unfortunately time is against us. So Dr. Shefali, thank you so much for joining us on the Mental Space.
Thank you so much for having me.
And if you've enjoyed this conversation half as much as I have, then please remember to subscribe on YouTube or indeed on any of the podcast platforms, yours of choice. We're on all of them. Once again, thank you, Dr. Shefali.
Thank you very much.